Good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started momentarily. All right, everyone, we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, and thank you all for being here. Please note that this press briefing will be recorded and published. First, my name is Alejandra Montoya Boyer, and I'm the Senior Director for the Center for Civil Rights and Technology at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. The Leadership Conference is a coalition of over 240 civil and human rights focused organizations with a longstanding history of work to transform both the legal system and emerging technology ecosystems to ensure equal justice, accountability, and the protection of civil rights. Last year, the Leadership Conference created the Center for Civil Rights and Technology to build on the historic and trusted legacy of our coalition to develop research, advocacy, and public education that seeks to create federal safeguards around AI and other emerging technology, to center the needs of our communities, and to protect our civil rights. Just last week, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights issued a report acknowledging the need for safeguards around facial recognition technology. In this report, they quoted KJ Bakchi, the vice president of the center, from his testimony in front of the commission this past March. The goal of today's briefing is to provide a deeper understanding of facial recognition technology, the real and potential civil rights abuses, and to provide policy recommendations and actionable next steps for advocates. With that, I would like to introduce our speakers. We have Tawana Petty, a social justice organizer from Detroit. Elizabeth Daniel Vasquez is the director of the Science and Surveillance Project at Brooklyn Defenders Service. Tiara Bradford is the senior program manager for justice reform at the Leadership Conference in Civil and Human Rights. And Frank Torres is the AI and Privacy Fellow at the Center for Civil Rights and Technology. We'll start with opening remarks from each of our speakers and then on to a few prepared questions for each of them. At the end, we'll open it up to our reporters for questions through the Q&A function. With that, I'll turn it over to Tawana Petty for opening remarks.
Thank you. I entered this work in 2012 as a concerned parent and resident who spoke occasionally about my concerns about data inequality and surveillance. Since that time, data justice advocacy has become part of my daily life. In 2016, I learned that Detroit city government and law enforcement will be entering into a public-private partnership with Guardian Alarm Company to launch Project Greenlight. My concerns grew, but I was not yet panicked. I was a community researcher with Detroit Community Technology Project, co-leading a research project with our data bodies, which was learning from residents across 3 cities, Detroit, Charlotte, and LA, about the impact of data extraction on their lives and what they felt were coercive trade-offs. It was during this time that we started to see a theme emerging among residents. They wanted to be seen, not watched. They felt that their data was being extracted from them for the benefit of corporations, government agencies, and law enforcement, but that those benefits were not trickling down to them. And in other instances, they described being trapped in a looping cycle of injustice, having mistakes they had made or errors placed on their records create a trail that followed them, preventing upward mobility. Anyone who has ever suffered a low credit score understands how difficult it is to have negative decisions based on the data collected about you define the entire trajectory of your life. By the time my research concluded in 2019, what had started as 8 or 9 gas stations that stayed open late, being monitored by Project Greenlight, had ballooned into over 550 locations, including medical facilities, churches, low-income housing, laundromats, educational facilities, recreation centers, restaurants, and more. It was during this time that I also learned that Detroit police was leveraging facial recognition technology with their CCT camera systems. The technology had been slipped under the radar and voted on by Detroit City Council without input from the public or the Board of Police Commissioners, which is the civilian oversight body put in place to ensure accountability by law enforcement. I immediately sprang into action, trying to educate my community on what I was learning. It was important to me that everyone understood what was behind those green lights blanketing the city. I was able to convene local community organizations, residents, and local legislators to host town halls, panel discussions, numerous public comment demonstrations at city council meetings, and at the Board of Police Commissioners. We worked with the late state rep Isaac Robinson to try and pass a moratorium, and with the ACLU to push for community input over government surveillance ordinance. Unfortunately, as with many policy opportunities, the ordinance that passed was not what was dreamed up by myself and many other community members. Even with the CIOX ordinance in place, surveillance has continued to proliferate across the city, though there have been recent attempts to strengthen the ordinance's power. Because of failed policy in Detroit, we're now one of the most surveilled cities in the United States. We currently rank 8th when considering surveillance cameras per capita. There are more than 900 participating locations tied to Project Greenlight's Pay for Priority policing program, and we are tracked by license plate readers, unmanned aerial vehicles, helicopters, cell phone tracking devices, shot spotter technology, and mobile surveillance towers. A lot of these surveillance technologies are being monitored by a centralized real-time crime center at Detroit Police Headquarters, as well as 2 precinct-level surveillance hubs, and by officers' mobile devices. Despite numerous studies highlighting the algorithmic biases and discrimination rooted in facial recognition technology and other forms of surveillance, which are nearly 100% leveraged against Black residents in the city, Detroit officials have continued to pour tens of millions of dollars into this experiment. The dangers of highlighting existing racial disparities in the legal system are already prevalent here. Cases like Robert Williams, Michael Oliver, Portia Woodruff, who were unjustly arrested because of reliance on facial recognition technology, and the recent case of Isoki Robinson from a license plate reader misidentification should be enough warning for cities across the country. We have all heard the saying, if there is smoke, there is fire. I am deeply concerned about the potential cases that we do not yet know about and the panopticonic future being designed for Detroit. Thank you.
Elizabeth, please jump in.
Thank you, Alejandra, and thank you all for being here. My name is Elizabeth Daniel Vasquez. I'm the Science and Surveillance Project Director for Brooklyn Defender Services. I've been a public defender working on issues of science and technology for about a decade now. Before that, was a civil rights attorney representing people who had been wrongfully convicted in suits against municipalities and police departments for the misconduct that resulted in those wrongful convictions. Where we are sitting today in terms of what it is like to represent clients who are charged with crimes is that we are at a place where it is both the same as it has always been and dramatically different. What we are seeing in our cases is a growing expansion of the use of data collection and artificial intelligence to leverage insights into cases and open up an ability to track people day in and day out in a constant and pervasive surveillance. At the same time, we are seeing the continuation of past mistakes made by our system to not engage in oversight or clear thinking about the deployment of new technical tools or new scientific entries into the criminal legal space. I started out in this work focused on the use of DNA technology in the criminal legal system, and even there, in a space where technology is seen to be scientifically underpinned, researched, and vetted, the use in the criminal legal system was deployed without much forethought or regulation or rules. We're seeing those same mistakes redound again in ways that reach more deeply into people's lives with the emergence of technologies like facial recognition. Ms. Petty's remarks bring to fore an important insight into what's happening in our criminal legal system, which is that this is not one technology's intervention that is causing a change. It is instead a network or fusion of multiple surveillance technologies. As a public defender, I can remember having case after case 8 to 10 years ago where we couldn't figure out how we had gone from an incident that happened 6 months in the past to our client being arrested 6 months in the future for that event. We went from point A to point Z, and there was no alphabet in between. And for years, it continued like this, where we were left to scratch our heads on what the investigative steps had been that had taken us from the start to the moment of the case beginning. It was only with research and advocacy from people like Claire Garvey and others in the space who uncovered for us that what was happening was that our police departments were using surveillance tools like facial recognition, and they were using them without telling anyone that they had. They were using them without verifying that the algorithmic development processes that went into creating those technologies actually worked in practice on the communities that they were attempting to use those surveillance tools on. They were using them without documenting how they were used, without creating a clear record of how many times a photo gallery was queried, without recording who was returned in full from those searches, and without disclosing ever to the defense or the defendant that this was the technology that had brought that person into the system. This is not justice. It is not a legal system that operates in a way that can reach equity or fairness or any notion of a right or true outcome. We are at a place now where, with the arrival of many kinds of surveillance tools and artificial intelligence insights, we are left to litigate cases on foundations of sand, where we do not know what steps law enforcement actually took, what investigation they conducted. We are instead presented a file that is missing countless underpinning pieces. And without our ability to investigate, without our ability to challenge, without our ability to litigate the constitutional underpinnings of the use of these technologies in our system, our criminal legal system ceases to be a place where truth is sought or people's rights are vindicated. Our Constitution cannot be fleshed out, and we are left in a space where what we will have are multiple instances of people being caught up in a system when they should not have been, of people being accused of crimes they did not commit, or people being convicted of circumstances that are not the true story of what happened. We have lived through a history of mass incarceration, and we are on a path to continue repeating our mistakes. It is time for there to be a change and for us to sit down as a community and actually think about regulating data collection, data use, data retention, data purposing and really understand what it means to suck all of this information from the Black and brown communities in our cities and use it in a way that continues to perpetuate racist outcomes. Thank you. I'll pass it to Tiara Bradford.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Again, everyone, I'm Tiara Bradford with the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. And I'll start by saying that facial recognition technology is purported to be an advancement improving accuracy in investigations, but it is actually inaccurate in many cases and extremely harmful due to the disproportionate misidentification of Black, Brown, Indigenous, and basically just non-white communities. In a study done by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, it was found that researchers have known this technology to be racially biased for many years, with Black individuals being up to 100 times more likely to be misidentified over white men. The misidentification leads to wrongful arrests, wrongful periods of incarceration, and potentially wrongful sentencing. This is a threat to the livelihood of people who have been misidentified and a theft of time that people will never get back. FRT furthers the criminalization of and surveillance of communities across the country. Technology that at times relies on racially biased arrest data can exacerbate the existing disparities within the criminal legal system. There are major civil rights implications of this technology with serious concerns over privacy and discrimination based on race. In Woodbridge, New Jersey, a man named Najir Parks was arrested for aggravated assault, unlawful possession of weapons, using a fake ID, possession of marijuana, and shoplifting because of a facial recognition scan that misidentified him. He spent 11 days in jail, and it took nearly a year for the charges against him to be dropped. Parks is now suing for a violation of his civil rights and intentional infliction of emotional distress. There are many more stories like his, but not all of them result in lawsuits. Over the past several years, many cities have enacted laws banning the use of facial recognition technology by their police departments. That includes Oakland, California, San Francisco, Boston, Jackson, Mississippi, Portland, Oregon, Minneapolis, and many more jurisdictions that to ban this type of technology. Federal legislation has been introduced, but has not come even close to passing at all. In fact, there aren't any laws or regulations on the federal level around this technology. In the policing executive order released in 2022, the administration ordered the DOJ to contract the National Academy of Sciences to do a study and subsequent report on FRT and create recommendations on their use by law enforcement. The United States Civil Rights Commission just released a report about facial recognition technology, its use by government agencies, and policy recommendations, including requiring scenario testing, and that would test the use of FRT in simulated cases to mimic real-world operational applications of FRT used by law enforcement. While this technology is still being utilized in jurisdictions across the country, the next step is to at least have a moratorium on their use until it's been shown that they aren't causing a desperate impact on Black and brown communities. But ultimately, facial recognition technology should not be used in police investigations. And with that, I'll pass it to my colleague, Frank Torres.
Thank you, Tiara. We've just heard about the harm people face when facial recognition technology is used. One reason why facial recognition technology has disproportionately harmed marginalized communities is because of high error rates, especially when identifying people of color. And why is that? Despite knowing the risk of using facial recognition technology for years, there is still lack of appropriate testing, as was noted by the U.S. Civil Rights Commission's recent report on the use of the technology. Yet, assessments and testing of AI systems for potential bias have been a fundamental part of most, if not all, responsible AI principles adopted by industry over the years. They simply talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk. The bottom line, given the threat to civil rights caused by facial recognition, it's right to question whether it should be used at all. The tech we use, especially when determining someone's freedom, should be proven to work before it is put into the field, if it should be used at all. Again, the tech we use, especially when determining someone's freedom, should be proven to work before it is put into the field, if it should be used at all. To begin to manage risk from rights impacting and safety impacting facial recognition means that agency and regulators and law enforcement and companies must act. And action is long overdue. There have been too many victims of misidentification to not do anything at this point. Steps must be taken to put in place impact assessments, real-world testing, and ongoing monitoring. If facial recognition is used, these are but a few of the safeguards that are needed. For example, first, if used, facial recognition systems should undergo rigorous testing for accuracy and fairness before deployment. This includes assessing how well the technology performs across different demographics, such as race, gender, and age. Second, testing must be done in operational or real-world settings. This isn't a laboratory exercise. For example, where there may be poor lighting, only partial images, or blurred images, you're going to get misidentification or inaccurate identification. Third, testing should be done pre-deployment. We shouldn't wait until the technology is deployed to take these measures. And fourth, there should be ongoing monitoring if deployed. And we can't forget, as others have said today, even if testing is improved for accuracy, the use of facial recognition technology should still be scrutinized, as it could lead to biased outcomes and exacerbate existing systemic problems that we have today. And why do we care about this? Put yourself in Portia Woodroll's shoes. As Tawana spoke to earlier, Portia Woodroll did nothing wrong. She was 8 months pregnant when she was misidentified and held in jail for 11 hours. She was finally released to go to the hospital when the stress of her arrest caused her to go into contractions. Had safeguards like the ones discussed today been put in place, then maybe, just maybe, victims like Portia Woodruff would not have been misidentified, wrongly accused, and detained. Alejandra, back to you.
Thank you, Frank, and everyone for your opening remarks. With that, we're gonna facilitate some moderated questions from me, and then I will turn it over to the reporters to ask questions in a bit. Tawana, I'd like to start with you. You have consistently challenged the narrative that surveillance technologies equate to safety. You also provided several examples of surveillance that went wrong or have been impacting your community. Can you describe those a little bit more and also describe the response from your community and organizers in Detroit?
Yes, so thank you for that question. The conflation of surveillance and safety has done a tremendous amount of damage on residents in the city of Detroit. Currently, we hold almost half of the known cases of misidentification using facial recognition technology. We have Robert Williams, who was not in Detroit at the time of an incident that occurred where he was accused of stealing watches and was arrested in front of his small children and incarcerated for over 30 hours. It led to health conditions. It led to mental and emotional impacts on his young children. We had Michael Oliver, who was arrested for a cell phone being stolen from a teacher. It was not him. He lost his job, his home, his car, and was unable to care for his small child. We had Portia Woodruff, as was mentioned by Frank, who was 8 months pregnant. She asked when the officers came to her home if the person accused of carjacking was 8 months pregnant. And they said, "We don't know, but the technology told us it's you." And they incarcerated her anyway. She was in danger of losing her baby. And then a recent case, which with license plates readers, where they use similar technology, we had Isoki, who was arrested. Her 2-year-old child who has autism was placed in the back of a police cruiser, and her car was impounded for 3 weeks, causing her to almost lose her job. And so these are just a few examples that I can list off the top of my head out of Detroit. And community members are, of course, upset and angry. And because there are no real policy preventions in place, we have some of the strongest policies because of advocacy against facial recognition technology and law enforcement use. However, those policies, even within place, are not preventing misidentification cases. They're not preventing systemic racial discrimination. They're not preventing law enforcement for leveraging this technology 100% against Black residents. And so we've organized numerous initiatives to try and rid ourselves of this technology, and community members are rightfully raising their voices and trying our best to prevent another misidentification case happening in the city.
Thank you for that. I'd like to follow up with, what are the better solutions to ensure public safety and balance accuracy, safety for all communities?
Well, I would say in Detroit, we're looking at a city where the median household income is under $35,000 per year. Those are poverty wages, which lead to a lot of quality of life crime, right? And so we understand that if you enhance the resources and quality of life supports in an impoverished community, you reduce crime. You only need to drive 15 minutes outside of the city where the communities are wealthy and fully resourced and the crime is limited, that you'll see that mass surveillance is not the solution for those communities. And so I think it's common sense. Any other community that's well resourced is not dealing with quality of life crime. And so we want the same solutions for our residents that any other community, mostly predominantly white communities that have these supports put in place, the recreation centers, affordable housing, affordable water, and racial discrimination to be eliminated. And so I think it's common sense. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to know that if a person is starving, if they don't have the proper mental health supports and things like that and supports in place, that they may have dehumanizing behavior. It is a human trait. It doesn't just happen in Detroit, but unfortunately, predominantly Black communities have different types of responses that are leveraged against them when we're suffering from those types of systemic issues.
Thank you, Tawana. I'm going to turn to Elizabeth to ask some questions about what you've seen with cases involving facial recognition technology, how they play out, and honestly, what is most concerning to you as a public defender with these technologies?
Thank you for the question, Alejandra. This is a spreading and sprawling question to answer, because what we're seeing right now in cases across Brooklyn is that facial recognition technology is being used routinely. But I want to take us back for a moment to 2018, 2019, when we as defenders first got public indication from research, from academics, basically, that let us know that facial recognition technology had been adopted by police departments, including New York's police department. For us, we had been representing clients in cases that involved surveillance footage for years, with no indication from the prosecutor or the NYPD that any sort of technological intervention had played a part in the analysis of that case or the investigation. So the first thing for us as defenders was to suddenly stop and look around at all of the cases that we had been handling for about 5 to 6 years at that point and recognize, wait a minute, any one of these cases could have had this technology deployed in it, and we just didn't know. So the first step for us, now 5, 6 years ago, was learning on our own. What is this technology? How does it work? What does the NYPD have? How are they using it? In what case? And we were having to do that investigation outside of the bounds of our cases themselves. And for folks who aren't criminal defense attorneys, I just want to flag, that's not normal. right? The way that the cases are supposed to operate, the way this is supposed to work, is that defendants are supposed to be told clearly and straightforwardly what the evidence is against them, what steps law enforcement took to investigate, who the witnesses are, and how the case was constructed, so that they can understand the charges against them, they can evaluate what their options are, and they can fulsomely access either a fair trial or a process to resolve their cases favorably for everyone involved. We were hampered from being able to do that at all by this entire lack of information. Today, with a new discovery statute in place in New York, we have had a bit of a shift in 2020, where at least in many cases, we are told facial recognition was used. Problem is that that's the extent of it. We get told facial recognition was used. And then we are left to understand on our own what that might mean, on what, how, what results came of it, what did law enforcement do with it. The best we get these days is a report that indicates that there was a possible match notification. We might get the photo that was submitted to the facial recognition algorithm. The very best we've seen is an edited screenshot of the dashboard that the NYPD uses to conduct facial recognition searches that shows a curated and edited section of what the NYPD officers reviewed when they came to a conclusion around a facial recognition search. We also routinely get told, we did facial recognition, we got this potential match, don't worry, facial recognition can't form the basis for probable cause, so we did further investigation. We emailed the last officer who in our system had contact with your client and asked them if they recognized the person in this surveillance video, and that officer said, yes, it is your client, and so don't worry, we have this really sound basis investigative step that is the actual evidence against your client. You don't need to worry about how facial recognition worked. As a person who's worked on the intersection of science into the criminal legal system for over a decade, there was an extensive amount of research and effort done around the social science failures of eyewitness identification. The fact that we are circling back into that same territory today, trying to launder the mistakes of a technical alleged identification mechanism through the lens of human identification without consideration for both automation bias and people's inability to identify other people in pictures is terrifying. The fact that we don't have clear documentation of the communication that goes from the facial identification section person and the detective to that last officer who allegedly had contact with my client. We don't know what was said. We don't know if they say, hey, we got a facial recognition match, we just need you to confirm it. We don't know what is happening, the sort of safeguards that have been agreed upon in the community overall about how eyewitness identification should play out have gone out the window. And so to Frank's point, what I've seen over and over again as a criminal defender is that we ask the question about technology or science of can we do this? Can we figure out a technical solution to this problem? But we don't ever stop and ask, should we? And the failure to ask, should we, is going to get us into the same trouble that we have gotten into over and over and over again in the past. Because the thing about artificial intelligence, any artificial intelligent tool, is that it is learning from past data to recreate past data in the future. If we want the future to be the same as the past, let's just implement AI and not worry about it. But I for sure would like for the future to be different than what we have seen come before in the criminal legal space. That was a long answer, Alejandra. I apologize.
It's really helpful to understand kind of when we're talking about our legal system, what is the full spread that we're seeing for defendants in this space. And I'm really curious if you could share just a little bit of the response to be able to protect clients in this space, what you all at Brooklyn Defenders Services are doing, but if there's other efforts in New York or elsewhere to support and protect clients, particularly from the improper uses, but a larger response as well.
The first place that efforts have started with public defenders across the country is getting people to understand that this is not facial recognition technology. This is facial similarity scoring. When we use words that suggest finality in the technology's capacity, we give up an understanding of what's really happening here. And so one of the first things that we've been trying to do is get people to really understand what this technology is doing within our system, so that prosecutors understand you don't have an identification. You have a ranked scoring of the similarity of the gallery of photos that you queried. We get judges to understand, this is similarity scoring. It's not identification. We've also been trying to get courts to understand how important it is that we get access to the information around this technical process. It's well understood in many jurisdictions that we need the full case file for DNA testing or fingerprint analysis, but for some reason it's difficult to put the mind around that we need full access to the documentation from facial recognition. We need to be getting full and complete discovery. And so that has been where a lot of effort has been put, is trying to educate what exists, why we need it, what sort of the full scale of what discovery would look like might be. And then the last point is, we do not have across the country jurisdictions that are routinely using the output of facial recognition as direct evidence in a case. That's great on the one hand, in the sense that this technology is not up to snuff on reliability or validity, and so it shouldn't be admissible if we were to get to the point of a prosecutor trying to present it. But the failure to present it as evidence creates real problems in terms of the development of law, because we don't have the capacity to bring before the court the issues that arise from the use of this technology. And so what we are trying to do is we are trying to flesh out moments to really litigate what the basis in validity and reliability of the tech is, and how it is impacting the human identifications that are happening after.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'd like my colleagues Tiara and Frank to answer a couple questions. Then we'll do a quick round for everyone and then turn it over to reporters for questions. But Tiara and Frank, we heard from both Joanna and Elizabeth about the broader, or excuse me, very specific examples in Detroit, and then responses from the public defender space. I'd love to hear about the broader implications for civil rights. What are the potential risks of this technology, and what can we do about it? So Tiara, start with you, and then we'll turn it to Frank.
I can get started. Yeah, there are several civil rights concerns when it comes to this type of technology. Arguably, the use of this tech by law enforcement is a violation of the Civil Rights Act and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment because of the racial discriminatory practice and impact that it has. Arguably, it's the use of this tech is an unreasonable search in violation of the Fourth Amendment right to privacy. I mean, that's just naming two. And I know there are several cases that are happening right now that are arguing the civil rights impacts of this type of technology. There's Parks v. McCormick that was filed back in January of 2024, and arguing that there was a violation of Mr. Parks' rights. Actually, I mentioned him in my opening statement. And of course, this case is still ongoing. And there's also Williams v. City of Detroit, and this case was actually settled in June. And again, it argued various claims around civil rights and law violation of state level laws as well in Michigan. And at the end of the day, the government should not be able to use technology that is known to have a disparate impact on Black and Brown communities, potentially depriving innocent people of their freedom, and in many cases without their knowledge, as Elizabeth was saying before. And I'll pass it to my colleague.
Sure. I think what we're seeing is systemic when it comes to artificial intelligence. everybody reaches for the bright, shiny object without thinking about the implications. And this becomes very important and very distressing, actually, when people's well-being is at stake. And we see people getting arrested because of faults in the technology, and also faults with the entities that we should be holding accountable for the creation and also the use of this technology. That goes from the companies that create the technology. Are they testing it properly with proper testing data? Is the technology actually fit for purpose? Have they tested it? Have they assessed it, again, in real world settings? What's the transparency like? If public defenders are being not given the information they need to defend people, where does that leave us? And again, we need to be putting ourselves into the shoes of the people that have been victims of this misidentification, and how difficult that is. So we've got assessments and testing, we have transparency, we've got accountability. There needs to be independent oversight and clear usage policies. If this technology is being used at all, including audits. We still don't have information about how many people have been identified, misidentified, how law enforcement agencies are using this technology. We don't have the numbers, and they have it. The U.S. Civil Rights Commission report called this out. There's also lack of training, and as Elizabeth said, there's oftentimes cases of automation bias, where you just go with the decision of the AI without further interrogating it. So there's lots of failures in the system throughout the use and deployment of the technology. And again, if we should use this at all, safeguards need to be put in place. Congress needs to act. Other regulators, the agencies ought to act as well. I'll leave it there, but happy to answer additional questions.
Thanks, Frank and Tiara. I'm going to add Elizabeth and Tawana back into the conversation. Frank teed this up nicely, talking about what are the next steps in terms of what are the policy recommendations and opportunities for federal legislators, the presidential administrations, state and local folks. What are the policies that we need to be able to prevent bias and harms from this technology? And Frank, I'll start with you, and then we can move around.
Wow. So where to begin on this one? I think I go back to what I said before, and I just want to make a note here. It's not just people and advocates that have concerns about the technology. The Las Vegas police officers who part-time working at a lot of the stadium and the games, the professional basketball and other games, have declined to be part of what the NFL wants to do, and that's use facial recognition technology for security reasons. So this is not what we're talking about here directly, but it's for security reasons where everybody wants to use facial recognition technology, and they're saying no, they're concerned about the privacy, they're concerned about how the data is being used. It's not even about arrests. It's not even about having, inaccurate images. You get your photo taken and they use it for security reasons. If they're raising concerns and are being distressed about the use of this technology for that reason, even though it's fit for purpose, supposedly, then there ought to be more conversation about the use of facial recognition technology by law enforcement to supposedly identify criminals. Because if the technology doesn't work for those instances, that's not keeping anybody safe. And I would submit that the technology is not fit for purpose.
Tiara, what should we be doing about this problem?
Yes, I can get started. I mean, there needs to be federal level regulations and laws around this technology. But before we even get there, how about the implementation of the many recommendations that come out from the Government Affairs Office, more recently for the United States Civil Rights Commission, from civil rights advocates who've had many recommendations on next steps with this technology and the standards and safeguards that need to be in place. We need to see that put into action. And yeah, it would be nice to see some legislation again in the executive order, around policing that came out in 2022. The DOJ was directed to do a study on this type of technology, and we just need to see those things actually happening. And in the meantime, how about a moratorium on using this type of technology? And I think ultimately, when we look at what these recommendations are really saying, it's going to lead to limited to no use of this technology, because even with safeguards in place, as my colleagues have mentioned on this call, we're just not seeing an improvement on the impact that this has on Black and Brown communities. And I'll pass it to Tawana or Elizabeth.
Yeah, I'll just agree with what Tara just said and say that, there was a blueprint for AI Bill of Rights that was introduced that, I think law enforcement inherently felt like they deserve carve-outs from. And I think that they should not have carve-outs from the 5 principles that are defined in that blueprint, which was safe and effective systems, algorithmic discrimination protections, data privacy, notice and explanation, and human alternatives consideration and fallback. Once you discover that a technology is causing algorithmic harm, there should be a human alternative, and that system should be removed from implementation. We need checks and balances at procurement, research, design, development, deployment, every stage of the data life cycle. And so we've made some attempts in Detroit. We tried to rewrite the city's constitution. Unfortunately, the narrative campaign in the city, which was funded by dark money and a lot of law enforcement push, had it voted down because community members are rightfully seeking safety. Unfortunately, the dominant pervasive narratives that convince us that surveillance is equal to safety lead us to make decisions that are not in our best interest. And so we need policy that attacks it at every angle. And at the very least, those 5 principles should be systematically and systemically embedded in the ways that government agencies and law enforcement leverage decisions around technologies.
Thanks, Tawana. While Elizabeth is answering with policy or local recommendations, reporters, please feel free to use the question and answer feature to start asking questions. If you can include your name and your outlet, that would be helpful. And I will get those moderated as soon as Elizabeth is done. And over to you.
I'm going to be really brief. I think that what everyone has laid out, I agree with wholeheartedly. I have 3 very short things. One, it's the data. Can we start talking about how we regulate and handle the data, how it gets taken from people, how it gets used by law enforcement, how long they get to keep it? 2, in 2009, the National Academy of Sciences looked at the problem of science in the criminal legal system with a report that was a path forward. Many of the recommendations in that report were not adopted. So to Tiara's point about there are many recommendations that are out there, to Tawana's point that there's the AI Bill of Rights, can we please just take a serious look at all of the recommendations that have come over the last almost 20 years on how we could do better? And then the last thing that I'll say is that we need to ask, should we? We need to stop making public safety the altar at which we sacrifice everything and really have a conversation about should we be doing whatever it is we are seeking in the name of public safety. So I will stop there.
Thank you all for that. It sounds like we all have a lot of work to do. I'm curious, Elizabeth, you brought up the point about data. What are we seeing in response to the potential racial biases in the data? Are there opportunities to be able to better protect and respond to this? And this is for anyone, but I would love to hear a little bit more. We haven't dived in as much on like where the root cause of bias in these technologies are really coming from. Is it just the data? Easy question, I know.
So I think that there has been much public conversation about the influx of bias being at the point of how you put together the data sets that train the algorithms. The truth of the matter is, if you look at the life cycle of the development of any artificial intelligence model, there are countless points at which bias enters the development, and correcting the training data set, if we could call it correcting, making it representative, handling the sampling problem, will not cure everything downstream. The larger concern that I think we all need to grapple with is, if we're talking about an artificial intelligence solution, we are talking about replicating the past. And unless we sit down and specifically engineer a different future, we are just tech washing mistakes that we have made over and over and over again.
I mean, I think it gets very complex, but complexities and challenges that have to be addressed. I wholeheartedly agree with Elizabeth. It is a lot to do with the training data, but it's just not that. It's some systemic issues that we have in this country with things like over policing in certain areas. You surveil certain areas, that could be potentially problematic. Tie that together with bad training data, lack of training for people on the opposite end, automation bias. Again, if you look at every step along the way, there's the possibility of embedding even more racial bias and issues throughout the use of these systems. If there's no consequence, then maybe we become a little bit less concerned about it. But in the case of facial recognition used for the purposes that we're talking about today, there are real harms that occur, which makes it our responsibility to hold those creating and using the technology even more accountable, to make sure that if the technology is used at all, that it's proper, that the technology actually works as it's supposed to work, and that the bias is mitigated or removed throughout. And if you can't do that, then we really need to question whether or not you should be using the system at all.
Thank you. We had another question. When solving crimes, what is the difference between law enforcement using facial recognition technology and other forms of biometrics like fingerprints and DNA? Isn't this just a new form of standard operating procedures? And Elizabeth, I think it would make sense to start with you, but if others want to jump in as well.
This is an interesting question. I've thought about it a lot. My experience in representing people charged with crimes is that when you're talking about DNA or fingerprint collection, that analysis is done after something has occurred that law enforcement intends to investigate, for the most part. The actual ability to collect those biometrics involves a physical intervention where law enforcement needs to come in contact with the scene of an incident and collect physical information from that scene. And then they need to come in physical contact with the person, either to actually take a buccal swab or a fingerprint, or to collect things that person physically left in a place. Facial recognition, you don't need to have in advance decided that you were trying to look at a specific event. You don't need to have come in contact with the person. This is cheap. It's pervasive. Anybody can do it. You don't need to have a laboratory or training or technical tools. We can talk about the problems with the expertise in DNA and fingerprints all day long, but there is at least a recognition that the people who do those things need to have been trained somehow. Those fields have documentation. Facial recognition does not. Those fields have some understanding that there should be fulsome studies that underlie the validation of those methods. Whether that understanding plays out in real life or not is a different question, but at least we academically acknowledge that that should be happening. facial recognition, on the other hand, we have, officers using things like Clearview AI on their phones without ever telling anyone. We have people, not understanding that you have to conduct tests to determine fit for purpose in terms of the tool that is being used and what it's being used on. We have an NYPD that has searched the internet for eyes or mouths in order to copy and paste those eyes or mouths onto probe photos to make them able to go through a facial recognition algorithm. The truth is that at least when we're talking about these other biometrics, there is a structure and an understanding around a need for rigorous scientific thought. Facial recognition is, let me just push this button and see what happens.
Do I have time to add, Alondra? Yeah, can I just add from advocacy perspective, I think for technology being used in law enforcement in general, I think the response is always going to be the same regardless of what type of technology it is. Like, we're always going to be concerned about the civil rights implications. We're always going to be concerned about the harms it has on communities. We're always going to want to hear from communities about the impact of this technology. We're always going to want safeguards, and we're always going to want some type of regulations in place, like regardless of what it is. So, I mean, thank you for that like breakdown and explanation, Elizabeth. I think that's super helpful. But I do think that the response would be the same for whatever technology is being used by law enforcement.
Yeah, I think that's a critical emphasis, Tiara. I'm going to combine our final question with the opportunity for like a closing. What do you want to leave us with? What's the number one thing that like we're coming out of here? This is what needs to be top of mind. But also I want to ask the question of, is this only a concern for law enforcement? Are we just talking about policing, or is this a broader issue connecting to other spaces? And if so, what? So Tiara, I'm going to start with you, and then we'll pass it around.
Yeah, I'll just note that, in the recent Civil Rights Commission's report, they talked about not just law enforcement, but other agencies that use this technology as well. And there were also recommendations on their use of the technology. I won't go into detail, but it's seeming like it's safe to say that it is an issue across the board, like not just in law enforcement. And I think the main takeaway for me would be a moratorium on this technology, like it being used on the federal level and in jurisdictions, I think is what we should be doing right now, while folks are still interested in doing studies and whatever that they're trying to do to examine this technology. We need to stop using it while the harm is still happening. And I'll pass it to my colleagues.
Sure, I'll jump in. And thank you for that, Tiara. And to the extent that despite calls for moratoriums, law enforcement and other entities decide to use it anyway, Congress needs to act, and they need to act now to implement strong safeguards like the ones that we discussed. We know what to do. Now the policymakers have to have the moxie to actually do something. And it is being used. We've seen similar issues in the immigration setting and housing and employment. And so, it's just going to be very, very important for us and all of us to continue to pay attention to this issue and to continue to push for strong safeguards.
And I'll say there was an effort that I was excited about through the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, where they started to try to push the lever on addressing human cognitive biases. I think if we pay attention to what's happening in the country, I would argue the world, but specifically the United States, we're having a racial reckoning. We're having any assault on discussions on racial equity, attempts to do policy around racial equity being attacked. And so we have to get very serious, those of us who want to be on the right side of history, and understand that not only do we have to address those human cognitive biases, but we have to understand that if we don't address those human cognitive biases, that they are going to translate into racial discrimination and harm within every technology and system that we develop, deploy, procure, or design. And so, yes, it crosses the gamut, not just surveillance technologies, but educational systems, housing, and other resources that we need to survive and thrive.
Elizabeth, any last words?
I'm going to yield my time. You're asking me to follow on to Wanapedi, and I am not going to do that. I am just going to say what she said. Yeah, no, this is excellent.
I feel that, Elizabeth. With that, I just want to thank everybody that was able to join us today. Thank you for your time, and please feel free to reach out to either Rachel Hooper or Mariah Wilchin. If you have any further questions, that's hooper@civilrights.org or wilchin@civilrights.org. And we'd love to connect you with our anyone speaking here today. If you have any further questions or would like to learn more about facial recognition technology and any harms and potential opportunities to redress said harms. So thank you again and have a great day. Thank you to our panelists as well. Thank you so much for being with us today. Appreciate you all. Have a great day.